Hey guys, Professor Bill, Comic Book University, and we're going to be doing a spotlight and story for Iron Man. And this is actually going to be a series, so it will be in the playlist for the spotlight and story, but even more so, it's going to be its own playlist because I'm going to be going over a spotlight and story for every single Iron Man armor that has existed for the most part, case by case by case. The first one obviously is the Mark One armor. This is going to be the easiest one because there was really technically only one appearance of the Iron Man Mark One. That's the gray armor, and when you look at it, it's pretty obvious. You know, the first appearance, gray armor. The very second appearance is the Golden Avenger armor, as it was called, where he actually made his debut in the Avengers, also using featuring that armor. The movie explains why this was the only armor that was ever used. It skipped over the yellow armor, all that, the golden armor and whatnot. But movies aside, this is the premier Mark One armor, the most basic, for the most part, armor that you could possibly imagine. Iron Man, Tony Stark, is a very significant character in the Marvel Universe. He was not the most popular character ever, even by comic book readers, standpoints. Even if you were reading the Avengers, you probably weren't reading Iron Man. Most people, most comic book fans could tell you a little bit about Iron Man, but they couldn't tell you about any individual stories in Iron Man because, for the most part, nobody cared. The comic book has had successive, drop offs and inclines, and the just it's an undulating wave of times that the character was even remotely popular. He was never super popular. In fact, the only time he became super popular was when Robert Downey Jr. took up the mantle of the character. That had significantly altered the history of the character, and suddenly everybody became an expert on the book. All things being what they are, we're going to discuss this first armor of Iron Man in this video and the significance of the character of Tony Stark. So, the Mark One first appeared. The was also the first appearance of Tony Stark in Tales of Suspense, issue number 39. This was a cover date of March of 1963. I believe this was also the release date because I haven't found any evidence to the contrary. Um, Tales of Suspense was an anthology of sci fi and supernatural stories. There were usually four stories in each of these books that would feature some random, never to be seen again, usually never to be seen again character, just like the four major anthology books from Marvel. For the most part, those were Journey into Mystery, Tales to Astonish, Strange Tales, and this title, Tales of Suspense. There were other anthology books also that went on for some small period of time. They usually dropped off or failed. There were plenty of major individual issues and runs of characters in and of themselves. In fact, when the excuse me, when the this issue, number 39 of Tales of Suspense, dropped March of 1963, there were several comic books that dropped this same month. One of them being Amazing Spider Man, issue number one. Yeah, the second appearance of Spider Man. Brings me into the idea that there was Amazing Adult Fantasy, 14 issues of Amazing Adult Fantasy. This was also an anthology comic book by Marvel. And issue number 15, they decided this was going to be the final issue. Nobody at Marvel thought that Spider Man was going to be any good except for one guy, that's Stan Lee. And they said, fine, you want to use this character, use him as one of the anthologies in the final Amazing Adult Fantasy book, which he was able to convince them to just call it Amazing Fantasy. So 14 issues of Amazing Adult Fantasy, one issue of Amazing Fantasy, and that was issue number 15, and then the book canceled. So Spider-Man immediately, like the popularity of the character, the letters that they got and everything, immediately came over to Amazing Spider-Man issue number one, which dropped the same month as the debut of Iron Man. Go figure. So we also have the Incredible Hulk issue number 6 dropped in this month. Very significant issue considering that this was the final issue of the Incredible Hulk. That's right, the Incredible Hulk was canceled because it simply wasn't a very popular character. Here's this big green oaf, kind of like Frankenstein. Who cares? We've got the Thing. And it was always argued that the Thing and the Hulk had equal strength, so who cares? They were both able to bench press or lift over their head approximately 5 tons, and they weren't bulletproof. Interesting, right? um, but yeah, the Hulk character, since Ben Grimm was, already the resident monster, they didn't need another character. The Hulk just simply wasn't selling, so issue number 6 was the final issue. Go figure, the same month as that issue dropped, we also had the issue number 12 of the Fantastic Four, which, go figure, the very first appearance or the very first crossover between the Hulk and Ben Grimm, which was also the first meeting between these two characters, which was also inevitably the first fight between these characters. So there's that. Significant times, my peeps. There was also Tales to Astonish issue number 41, which I believe was the 7th appearance of Henry Pym as Ant-Man. There was actually a prior appearance several issues before he became Ant-Man where Henry Pym simply shrank, and yeah, all sorts of cool stuff happened. But yeah. There was also Journey into Mystery issue number 90, which I believe was the 7th appearance of Thor. I could be wrong on that, but either way. Appearance of Thor in Journey into Mystery, because there were also those appearances in the Venus comic book. Granted, it wasn't really the same Thor, but technically it was the same Thor in the Marvel Universe, so it is what it is, but I digress. There was also Strange Tales, issue number 106. This was, again, also an anthology comic book. It featured the Human Torch and the rest of the Fantastic Four, as you can clearly see. But this was a very interesting book because this was actually the last of the books that crossed, or that while it would have two stories, or half the comic book would be the Human Torch stories, the other half of the comic book would still be anthology, an anthology of two different stories, monster stories or sci-fi stories, whatever. I believe that the first appearance of the Watcher and his origin, was actually in that comic book. It wasn't until much later that Nick Fury and his Howling Commanders, would be ended, and Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., would appear in this book. And then, of course, most famously, this is also the book where Doctor Strange would eventually appear. You also had several other stories that would, or characters, whatever. Basically, the other comic books that dropped at about this time were Gunsmoke Westerns, issue number 75. You had Kid Colt Outlaw, issue number 109, and Two Gun Kid, issue number 62. So 3 Western comic books, individual characters, Westerns, cowboys with, their 2 guns and whatnot, and they would go around and clean up the Wild West. This was still popular during this time when Iron Man first debuted. Hey, you know what else was also popular? They had Love Romances, issue number 104. How many comic books get canceled, saying at issue 6 or 8 or 12, right? Meanwhile, Love Romances was still going strong at issue number 104. Even better than that, Millie the Model, issue number 113, dropped on this same month. So that's what, 3, 6, 9, 12. 12 comic books that dropped in this month. That is wild. And you look at the range of these particular comic books. That's just crazy. To me, at least, that's crazy. But again, this was an anthology comic book that eventually did, Tales of Suspense, that did eventually start bringing in superheroes. Much later on, Captain America would also debut in these comics. Now, something that's very interesting about this is that the cover of this comic book actually still looks like it's a monster book. When you think about characters like It, the Living Colossus, and Zemu, the original Incredible Hulk, and the original version of Groot, and many other monsters that would appear in these anthology comic books, this looks like it's just going to be another one of those. You see human hands off screen, no face, off panel, no face, grabbing parts of this suit and this big Iron Man, this menace. Look at what he says. He lives, he walks, he conquers. Who or what is the newest, most breathtaking, most sensational superhero of all? It does say superhero, but when you look at the way that it's written, when you look at the way that the comic book, the cover art actually shows, when you think about the idea that Kirby was still looking at, mind you, Kirby did the covers, and the covers came before the interior art. That's going to be important. What's about to happen next? But when you think about that, Kirby was drawing these covers. He didn't necessarily know everything that was going to be happening in the comic book himself. So he looked at it as, hey, Tales of Suspense, these are monster stories, right? Okay, you give me a little bit of direction, I'm going to do so and so, such and such. Cool, man. But for the most part, this is going to be a monster book, right? But there was this one little part that was put at the bottom from the talented, that's in red with yellow letters, from the talented bullpen, where the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Thor, and your other favorite superheroes were born. Oh my. Oh me, oh my. So, while this does have the outward appearance of a monster book, it was a little bit more telling when you actually read the story, but not so much more. It still had that Tales of Suspense feel to it. In fact, just look at the very next page. Iron Man with the rivets, dotted all around it, keeping these iron, bars in place. Iron Man is born. And you see him actually, it looks like he's ripping apart the pages of the comic or an entire mountain to come right at you and to get you. All of it. It screamed of amazingness. Now, we're going to take a really quick look at the creators for this comic book. The editor and story plotter was Stan Lee. The scripter, so the person who actually wrote out the script himself, was Stan Lee's brother, Larry Lieber. Story artist was Don Heck, but the cover art and character design, and of course the layouts, were done by Jack Kirby. So it's important to understand, and Don Heck, I think, talks about this more than anybody else. He's discussed how, what do you call it? The design of Marvel was supposed to be based off of the work of Jack Kirby. So everybody, with the exception of Gene Colan, but that's another story. Everybody, for the most part, had their own drawing style, but the layouts had to be, the original penciled work had to be something from Jack Kirby. So you would either have something that you could trace off of what Jack Kirby was doing, or Jack would just really quickly in light pencils sketch out what he wanted to do. Ba 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 bow, next, ba 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 bow, next, ba 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 bow, next. It is in fact one of the reasons, besides the fact that Jack Kirby had the most amazing work ethic of any writer ever, or excuse me, any artist ever, because he did also usually write the comic books. The script and whatnot, even if his notes weren't necessarily used. Jack Kirby was able to produce 10 pages a day easily because he was doing his amazing artwork, boom, 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 and then moving aside. He didn't have to go into extensive detail with it. He didn't have to do the inks and the finished work for it. Instead, in this particular book, as an example, Don Heck would do that. And Don Heck actually had so much to do with this book that while he was always an inker, and inkers very rarely get credit for the creation of certain characters. Case in point, nobody ever looks at Lieberman. Darn it, how am I forgetting his name? Joe Rubinstein. Very few people actually look at Joe Rubinstein as one of the original creators of the Infinity Gauntlet storyline, or as one of the creators of Gambit, per se. He did the inks for Gambit, which is usually the finished work for Gambit. And most people don't look at what the inkers did. In this very rare instance, Don Heck did so much work on the interiors of this comic book, he literally made the characters his own, and he is, for the most part, sole designer for Tony Stark. So this is one of the very exceedingly rare moments where an inker actually gets credit for the creation of a character. That's important to remember, and it's very important to the legacy of Don Heck in and of himself. So, moving on, the covers were created first, so the initial creation of the Iron Man armor should, in fact, go to Jack Kirby. But again, so enough of that. So the character Tony Stark, we actually begin with in a secluded area. Somewhere in the U.S. defense perimeter, there stands a closely guarded building, the laboratory of Anthony Stark. Now, U.S. defense perimeter, all that good stuff. Yeah, 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 yeah. Basically, this was the Vietnam War. All right, and you have an industrialist, Tony Stark, who is responsible for the providing weaponry to the military. And in this particular case, he's trying to provide something else to the military also. So the the main idea, and I think most people know this, that Stanley had was to use Howard Hughes, write down that name, and look up this human being, this living, real life human being, who was the main inspiration that Stanley had for the character of Tony Stark. He was an inventor, an adventurer, a multi-billionaire, a ladies' man, and a nutcase. In Stanley's own words. Stanley decided to recreate that minus the nutcase. There would be several writers who would later on add something in place of the nutcase. But yeah, to try and go into further depth of the Tony Stark character. But this was basically Stanley taking a challenge for himself. He was very high on himself, and in my opinion, for a very good cause. He did revolutionize Marvel. You can look at the art and the characters and whatnot, but Stan Lee gave a personality to these characters that no one else in comic books, in my opinion, has ever matched. So, crucial, crucial. And several of my interviews with writers and artists, you can see these guys unabidden saying the exact same thing. So Stanley took a challenge for himself, and he says, young people hated at the time war, big businessmen, and people who made munitions. So he decided to make a character who was a war profiteer, made munitions for the military, and he was in fact a big businessman. This was kind of his play on capitalism at the time. And you have to look at the idea that this was in fact the 60s, the very early 60s. You have to look at a lot. A lot that was happening during this time. Initially, Iron Man was Stan Lee's vessel to explore the Cold War. So, all of this being what it was, yeah, while the Vietnam War is a very complicated issue, there was for a very long time before the war was actually declared, there was always this big problem as we saw it in Vietnam. In fact, the whole idea was based on the Cold War. Ever since World War II, with Russia deciding to go isolationist again because it didn't trust the rest of the world, and for very, very valid reasons. They decided to stay within themselves, and there was a lot of distrust between even during the war. While Russia was an ally of the Allied powers, they and therefore brought into NATO and the UN. They were never ever trusted, and vice versa. The feelings were mutual. So, and a lot of this had to do with the idea of communism versus capitalism. So these proxy wars were many times provoked, and the number one proxy war was the Vietnam conflict, eventually the Vietnam War. So this was basically Stan Lee used Iron Man and Tony Stark as a vessel to talk about the Cold War. There were many times where Captain America was brought back, or a version of him, in order to actually be a vessel to talk about the Cold War, but it never worked. He was always a vessel of the Hydra, or more specifically the Nazis. Hydra was the allegory for the Nazis ever since, but yeah. So this was basically, like I said, this was Stan Lee's way of saying, I wonder if I can actually make people feel bad for and sympathize and enjoy stories by a guy who they otherwise would hate. So it is interesting. A lot of times when people think of engineers, you think of Tony Stark. If you're in the comic books, I was an engineer. I was an electrical engineer specifically, and I can assure you that absolutely no, engineers are not super duper rich fat cats, unless you're like some of the premier engineers, of which I simply was not. I was simply a part of a team, and we all created some amazing products that you do still have in your home, probably that you carry on your person all the time. That being said, Tony Stark was supposed to be this model of, hey, engineers, while they're usually poor and treated very badly by the actual rich fat cats who don't have anything to offer except the inheritance fund that they got from their parents, hey, they're going to exploit engineers, take their patents, take their intellectual property, and boom, move on. Tony Stark is considered that engineer who was also the rich financier. So he was the whole package. So he actually got to be unbidden, much like the very rare character of Howard Hughes. Now, Tony Stark was a multi-billionaire. For the sake of reference, at the time, the first recorded, and you can't hide something like this, the first multi-billionaire was recorded in 1916, and that was J.D. Rockefeller, or by the loving name that the people who knew him, or knew of him at least during the time, J.D. Rockefeller. So J.D. Rockefeller, go and look up this character because he was also an influence for this character. And for the sake of conversation, also consider looking up William Howard Taft, who was the president at the time, who actually allowed for the monopoly that J.D. Rockefeller created in order to become a multi-billionaire, the first multi-billionaire. So, Tony Stark is here in, it doesn't say Vietnam, but it's obvious it's freaking Vietnam. And he's hanging out with this general, and it's known that his weapons have actually, it's discussed in the book briefly through the soldiers and the officers talking, that Tony Stark has provided multiple amounts, like a plethora of weapons and munitions to the military to further enhance the war effort. So he was a war profiteer. Bottom line, Tony Stark was a war profiteer. Hey, the longer this war goes, the more money that I'm going to make because I'm giving you the guns and the bullets to beat up this enemy. If there's no enemy, then there's no war. If there's no war, there's no profit for me. And that's the bottom line. He was not supposed to be somebody who you necessarily appreciate. So Tony Stark, now apparently not happy with enough money that he's making, he decides to make some other device using tiny transistors. This was always a big joke in the comic books, tiny transistors, tiny transistors. Stan Lee has mentioned how nobody in the comics, in the comic book writing or art industry was a scientist. The closest you'd probably come to would be like a Jack Kirby, who did actually subscribe to plenty of scientific magazines. He was always interested in these things, and you can by all means go and look up my small documentary 4-parter on Jack Kirby to get a better understanding. Or there are plenty of documentaries out there that are probably far better, but what do I know? Anyway. These guys didn't actually know what a transistor could do. They had a very, very rudimentary understanding of what transistors would do. But in here, they had it so that the transistor could actually amplify the power of a magnet. So yes, here is a little hand magnet that they would clamp down, bolt down really solid onto this heavy piece of equipment, and then add a single tiny transistor to, or whatever, and it would magnify the power of the magnet, so it would actually rip a steel vault door off its hinges, and yeah, so it could lessen the weight of the equipment that the soldiers were wearing, almost miniaturize it, so they could transport from here to there without heavy machinery, just by walking. So oh my god, this is just really weird. So, real quick discussion of what transistors actually are. Bell Labs in Manhattan in 1947 unveiled the first transistor. Transistors are solid-state alternatives to vacuum tubes. Uh, Basically, a transistor is meant to change the resistance of the germanium. Germanium was widely used long before silicone was considered viable, or was recognized as a very viable alternative and much cheaper version of germanium. But hey, that's the way that businesses work. So uh, by changing the resistance of the germanium, it also changed the electron flow. This way, if you had two different contact points for this transistor, one would actually be higher capacitance than the other one, which basically makes a transistor an amplifier. Hence, it would amplify the power of a standard house magnet. It's not the way it works. But in real life, it would amplify the power coming into the transistor. So that made it extremely useful. Uh, Other minor things. This was basically an amplifier. Vacuum tubes relied on transconductance, but this new device relied on transresistance. Therefore, it was called the transistor. This transistor is considered the most important invention in the 20th century. The transistor has also been dubbed the most important thing in the 20th century. So, when you think about it, fire, the wheel, very important. The 6 or 8 original tools ever used, hey, very important. All these things. But for the modern era, or at least for the last generation, when you think about it, the space race wouldn't have been possible. Having phones, look up how many how many tiny transistors are in your phone. And after your jaw comes up off the ground, recognize just how important the transistor is. How, especially when you start, laying, the surface with silicone in order to get the results that you want with it. Transistors are mass produced. And of course, later on there's the idea of Moore's law where, every 2 years it would double in not only price, but in productivity. That, of course, is coming to an end right now, and we are looking for the next big thing. So, hey, if you're even halfway decent with math, you could do the next transit. You could actually create the next big thing. But the most recent big thing was the transistor. It genuinely is the most important thing that has come up anywhere. We do not have our modern ways of life, our cultures and everything without transistors. Crucial to our standard of living today. That being said, you can understand, I imagine, why um, Stan Lee decided he wanted to explore this particular character of Tony Stark. So, for some odd reason, they say, hey, you did such a great job. Why don't you walk with us to go and do the things that we want to do? Saying we're going to bring all of these munitions to this other part. And you, not being in fatigues, or OD Green at the time, you just walk with us in your business suit through the hot jungles of Vietnam because, sure, that's a thing. So, anyway. We get to learn more about the idea that Tony Stark is a brilliant inventor, the most eligible bachelor playboy ever. And we also learn a little bit about Wong-Chu. Him and his Red Army, they menaced the Vietnam jungle. They actually say the South Vietnam jungle. That's important. The South Vietnam jungle, not even the North. So Wong-Chu was, besides a particularly impressive military general, and later on he would be described as somebody who actually worked at the behest of the Mandarin. They would explore the character a lot more, but for now he's just this ridiculously big guy who is unbelievably strong and a really great fighter, like physical martial artist combatant. And he would use his judo skills and he would beat the living crap out of anybody. The way that Wong-Chu would actually do things, he was so full of ego, as fighters are. Whenever they would go into and conquer a new village, he would say, hey, I'll free all the people in the village and leave this village right now if anybody in this village is able to beat me up. So any of the strong men or tough guys or martial artists who wanted to step up to the plate, come on up. He would take them all on, one after the other. And if you couldn't beat him, boom, there you go. But if you could, the village would be freed. Clearly, there were no free villages. So there's that. But anyway, it's just plot point. So, plot element, I should say. So, there's an interesting take on Vietnam and how they're massively outnumbered and things like that. Okay, 1963, sure, I guess. I can see that. But anyway, Tony Stark winds up tripping over a tripwire in his really nice, classy shoes. Probably a lot more expensive than my Stacey Adams. And he sets off an explosion. It winds up killing or knocking out a whole bunch of the soldiers that are there, and it knocks him out also. Also puts a little bit of shrapnel in his chest. They do what they can for him, but there is still a lot of shrapnel in his chest. And he gets captured by the Red Army, the Red Guerrillas, as they're called. G-U-R, not G-O-R, just saying. So they capture him and they're like, "Hey, what's up? Is this guy going to be okay with that shrapnel in his chest?" It's like, "Nah, he's going to be dead inside of a week. He's got maybe a week to live." So he's like, well, I'll use him and I'll trick him. Hey, American, I'm talking English now. Listen, man, we're gonna let you go, but first you have to make us, a totally awesome weapon that's going to help us beat the army." And he's like, "Well, they're going to kill me either way, or I'm just not going to survive. They're full of crap. But if it's going to buy me some time, hey, let's do it." So they're both, thinking to themselves, "I'm going to outsmart the other." One of them's right. The other one is Wong-Chu. So, what do you call it? Tony Stark is ridiculously slow doing that. Like, he is unbelievably freaking slow in doing this stuff together because, of course, the weapon he's going to build is the Iron Man armor. So Wong-Chu, he has this one guy, this old one, Professor Yinsen. Later, I believe his name would be Yinsen Ho or Ho Yinsen. Yinsen Ho, yeah, Yinsen Ho. His last name Ho. You would find out more about his family members throughout several story arcs. Joe Quesada and I think Jim Byrne also, and then Al Ewing. As well. Most recently, Al Ewing. Anyway, so Professor Yinsen, and he's just basically this guy who was captured, whatever. He's got his own story. It's funny, a lot of people talk about the Uncle Ben characters and whatnot. One of those characters has also been Yinsen. I do believe they have never actually brought him back since this one appearance that he had. It's only been in memory or retrospect that they ever discussed Yinsen. So, interesting. Anyway, he was a professor. He was a really smart guy. He didn't want to help out Tony until he realized what his plans actually were. I'm going to make this suit that's, one, going to, the shell that's going to keep me alive, and two, allow me to beat up all these bad guys. You know what I'm saying? So to me, this is a fantastic plot point because Tony could have just made a gun, a special kind of like, cluster bomb or whatever, people seekers or neural stunning device, whatever. He could have made a whole bunch of different things to actually stop this army, but he also had to save his own life. And the most important asset that Tony has is his life. I think that's the most important asset that we all have. But hey, Tony Stark isn't necessarily the heroic type. Tony Stark is not the type who's going to say, if it's the last thing I do, I'm going to stop these guys. No, he's like, I am going to stop these guys, but it's not going to be the last thing that I do. I'm living. So he did risk, and if Yinsen wasn't thrown in there with him, he wouldn't have been able to finish this in time. Just there's absolutely no way this would have happened. So it's the idea that Tony Stark decided, I am definitely living. He had a strong sense of self-preservation. Hey, is what it is. I can't hate on the guy for that. So I need to make this device that's going to keep me alive and allow me to beat up all these bad guys. Since Yinsen was thrown in afterwards, maybe if he had enough time, he would have made one for Yinsen also. Who knows? But he had to get this thing working and get inside of it and get it charged in order for him to actually survive. And that's basically what wound up happening. They both wound up making this armor based on the scraps that they had available. It was basically a whole bunch of gears and levers. He was also using his tiny transistors to massively, drastically decrease the weight of this thing, and to actually operate the levers and gears, because he's not going to have, like, this, that, and the other thing and whatnot. But anyway, he was able to make this device, and then he's like, I need to get in this thing, like, I'm about to die right now. Jensen's giving him encouragement. You get inside that thing right now. Let's go. He's going to buckle him up. He's going to plug him in so that he can start being charged, so that it can actually keep his heart alive and charge the rest of the armor as well, in order to help him kick some butt and take some names. The Reds start actually coming in, and he's like, listen, just like in the movie, I don't know what to tell you, man. I need you. I think Tony Stark was actually mostly unconscious, or mostly, just like, yeah, whatever. He was conscious, but he there wasn't much of anything he could do. He was laid on the table. He was done for. So Jensen says, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to buy you the time that you need. And he did. He ran out. Death to Wong-Chu. Death to the evil tyrant. Wong-Chu's like, look at this psycho, man. He's going crazy. He's going mad. Kill him. So you actually hear the bang outside, and it's done. Drag him away. So they drag his body away. They don't bother coming in immediately to check on Tony Stark. Hey, good thing for Stark, because he was still charging. But he's like, you will not have died in vain, my friend. I swear it. The Iron Man swears it. So Tony finally finishes up, and he actually has enough time to, I guess, realistically figure out how to actually balance himself in this armor. Because, mind you, it's iron. Iron is not a very reliable metal in regards to being able to use your own body to lift things, especially since he's got shrapnel through his chest, so, through his heart. Yeah, he's not lifting anything. He's using the transistors to actually control everything. So while his appendages are actually in the armor's appendages, he's not, like, cramped inside the chest and, like this and whatnot. It's the idea that the iron of this armor is way too ridiculously heavy, plus all the armaments that are in it, way too heavy for him to ever consider actually moving it with his own strength. No, it's through the transistors. So he's got to learn how to walk again, and he does it fairly quickly. And the first power that he uses when these guys come walking in is his air jet boots that allow him to, with, small turbines, the air pressure, transistor-powered air pressure jets, to make him jump up, not fly, but to jump up. And then suction cups. I'm going to fasten these suction cups to my palms, and then use the boots to jump up, and I will stick to the ceiling, and nobody will look up and see me way up here. My God, you gotta love comic books. But anyway, this was the best that they had at the time. So, in the fashion of Ben Grimm, he decides to get a very giant-sized trench coat and a hat, and he puts them on, and he goes walking out to get up close to Wong-Chu. He's like, ha, I win again. You can't stop me, and none can defeat the mighty warlord. Everybody's, all sorts of freaked out. If we could just beat him, our village will be free. And all of a sudden, Tony Stark comes up in his Iron Man suit and says, I say he's a coward. I challenge Wong-Chu. He's like, what? I'm about to jack you up, fool. So Iron Man's like, he opens up his cloak, his trench coat, and he reveals the giant armor monstrosity. It's like, dude, is this guy some kind of a monster? Of course, the typical back in the day. Why do you stare, Wong-Chu? What is wrong? Have you never seen an Iron Man before? Dude, technically nobody's ever seen an Iron Man before, I'm saying. So he's like, you're not a human, you're a machine. And he's like, and you're a heartless man, evil man who's about to pay for his misdeeds. So they shoot at Iron Man, and Iron Man, of course, is bulletproof. These small munitions just bounce off him. It's like, dude, they got no chance against him. And this is cool, because even the Thing back in these days was like dodging bullets, saying, oh, crap, he's shooting at me, I better move out of the way. What? You know what I'm saying? Hulk was able to take some bullets inside of him and be like, ha, I'm so huge that your little tiny bullets don't do anything to me. Ben Grimm was like, no, I need to move. There was never the idea that rocks could actually deflect bullets, so... Makes sense when you think about it logically. Anyway, these bullets bounce right off of Iron Man. So that right alone made him very different from so many of the characters out there. He's bulletproof, That makes him awesome. Hey, later on they'd make Luke Cage, who was basically a really strong bulletproof dude. That's a power. That's a power. Um, so using transistors, he would reverse the charge on this small magnetic turbo insulator. It's basically another one of those little tiny magnets, like a horseshoe. There's a magnet, and he would attach something on there. And this is actually interesting. And I'll use a top hat transistor to increase its repelling power 1,000-fold. Top hat transistors are a real thing because they actually look like top hats. Hey. So anyway, he would use it, and there's actually the big, what do you call it? Solid base on the bottom. I guess, I would imagine some part of that, the largest part of that must be the heat sink. Anyway, so he's able to make it so that the guns don't work anymore because they go to get bigger weapons. Get the rockets, blow this guy up. But he reverses the polarity on a magnet to make it so these bigger, the grenades and the bazookas, they're not actually going to work. So they go and point the weapons, and all the metal is repulsed from him. Okay, cool. Hey, I'm down with it. I'm down with it. So he actually holds a magnet. All right. Oh, I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. So anyway, Wong-Chu goes on top of the radio tower and starts, trying to blare out with the. It's not a megaphone. It's actually through electronica that he's just like, hey, I need you guys to all rally together. 10,000 yen to the one who destroys Iron Man. But Iron Man sees what he's trying to do, and he's like, oh no. And he uses his small antenna over here to actually be much bigger when it's the yellow armor. For now, it's a very small antenna. Hey, resources. And he puts full squelch on the radio. So this way it just comes out as awk, bark, bark. It doesn't come out the proper way. So he creates electrical interference to drown his words out with static. Hey, love it. I love it. I love the scientific, the I don't know, the attempt at scientific explanations for these things. When you think about it, this is a character that is just so completely far removed from anything that DC Comics has ever or would ever do. DC Comics has wanted a character like Iron Man for forever, and they've made several characters that tried to replicate him, but they were never, ever able to duplicate him. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there's a lot of characters who they would both, and nobody's, more duplicated than Superman and Batman, for crying out loud. So make no mistake, I'm not trying to do a pro Marvel or pro DC thing here. I'm just, discussing. But one of the characters that DC has always wanted to replicate was Iron Man, but they could never, ever come even remotely close to it. That's a huge deal. It really is. Wong-Chu would then take a cabinet filled with rocks, because apparently that's a thing that he just had lying around. Powerful transistor makes this miniature buzzsaw inside my index finger container outperform anything a dozen times its size. Cool, man. So he just basically has a saw blade that comes out and then bzzz, and he's able to, go around. Hey, lightsabers weren't a thing back then. So that would be several years in the future. A decade, almost, a decade and a half, we'd have lightsabers. But for now, miniature buzzsaws powered by tiny transistors. It's a thing, all right? Hey, Vibraxes. They eventually, came from that also. So, or vibro weapons, I should say. Anyway, Wong-Chu just so happened to have this freaking 3-drawer chest, filing cabinet filled with rocks. Cool. And he throws it down on Iron Man. But Iron Man, with his transistor-backed strength, is able to overcome the weight. But it took too much charge away from him. He expended too much energy. So he's like, dude, I need to recharge, and I need to recharge now. Otherwise, the armor's going to give out, in which case my heart's going to give out, in which case I'm going to wind up freaking dying. So, all things being what they are, he decides to use something that's not going to take a whole lot of energy from him, and he puts down a whole bunch of oil. And then he uses his little, I don't know, he's got some kind of a torch on him. It's actually a little torch gun, and he shoots it down, and boom, we think that's the end of Wong-Chu. Oh, Wong-Chu's dead, all right? But we find out much later on other writers way down in the future would actually bring Wong-Chu back for a short time. Hey, that's cool. You know what I'm saying? But Cool flash from the past. But for now, basically, Iron Man is okay with killing. Because, mind you, we weren't fully cognizant of what superheroes actually were. Superheroes not killing. What? Captain America used to kill all the time back in Captain America comic books. See what I'm saying? Why wouldn't Captain America be willing to kill? He was a soldier, for crying out loud. But later on, it's like, no, 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 superheroes don't kill. That's important, and that would be a universal motif. But for now, Iron Man had no problem with killing this fool. So it's all over. Hey, I can leave now. And he actually, um, what do you call it? He puts the trench coat and the hat on, and he's going to walk back to wherever he's got to walk to in order to be safe. Judging by the colors and whatnot, it looks like he actually has his business suit on, but where would he have put the armor? Fat chance of him leaving it there. Anyway, it's the idea that Iron Man then leaves. So there is the slight possibility that they were originally intending for him to not be able to take off the armor. Either way, is what it is. This is what we got. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Iron Man armors. Why were there so many marks? Why were there so many versions of the Iron Man armor? Well, in story, because he was always improving his armor, right? That's what happened in the comic books. But the real story behind it was that Stan Lee was never, ever pleased with the look and design of Iron Man. It wasn't until much later, when he couldn't see well, that he was like, oh yeah, the movies got it right. Stan Lee's a people person. He wants to just make people happy. That's who he is. That's what he's always been about. I don't know if he's ever been satisfied with the armor ever, but in the comic books, he's never been happy with it. So when he looked at this, he's like, well, we got to meet the deadline, so put the presses out, put it to the press and get the comic book out. But darn it, I want this character changed. And that would always be the case. At one point, he came in and he complained, hey man, the nose is too flat. You know what I'm saying? Like, how's he going to fit his nose in there? People need a nose. So they gave him a nose for 16 issues, whatever it was. Iron Man had a nose. Until Stan Lee walked back and he looked at the art and he's like, what the heck is this? That nose looks stupid. Who said to put a nose on him? You gotta love Stan Lee. Anyhow, so the armor was constantly always changing because Stan Lee was not happy with whatever the artist was doing with the armor. And that's just facts, man. No artist was able to satisfy Stan Lee with the design of that armor. If only Stan was an artist himself, right? Could have been fixed. But at the same time, Iron Man wouldn't have been nearly as interesting. Just like you're always going to see a new Iron Man armor in each and every movie that Iron Man is in. Because, hey, merch. You got to sell that merch. The precedent for that was set with issue number 2. Technically, Tales of Suspense, issue number 40. Because Iron Man's armor was constantly upgrading, updating. Basically, the look was changing because the boss wasn't happy with the way it looked. It is what it is, my peeps. It is what it is. So, guys, that is the Spotlight on Story for Iron Man Mark 1. Hey, just a quick suggestion, if you really got anything of value from this and you're really looking forward to seeing more of these videos, one for each and every single one of these Iron Man Mark 2, Mark 3, Mark 4, Mark 5, Mark 7, hey, then by all means, leave a link. Just leave a link. Don't leave any links. Turn the phone sideways and leave a like, that L word. And then, maybe consider watching an ad if it shows up at the end of this, because that's the only way that your favorite YouTubers get paid. So I kind of like getting paid for this. It is what it is, man. Anyway, guys, all the love in the world. Enjoy. See you back for more Iron Man armors. Professor Bill, Comic Book University. Class dismissed.